Yes, we are our last one. All right, let's go with some Latin American revolutions. And let's start off with our first one, which would be Peninsular. Peninsular, those would be the people who are from the peninsula. Basically, the people who are from the Iberian Peninsula, which would include the land of Spain. So the people who went to Latin America but were born in Spain, they were the highest class in the Spanish colonies. So when we look at this map here, basically if you were born here and then you went over here to where the Spanish controlled their colonies, but you were born here, you were peninsular. That's what made you peninsular. And you were the highest class in their system. This would be like the La Casta system we looked at. The peninsulars were on the top. Second term, the Creoles, or as my wife says, the Creoles. These would be the people who, they weren't born here, but their parents were. Both their parents were. So they had ancestry that was pure Spanish, but they were born over here. So apparently being born over here did something to bring you down a notch on the social scale. So they were the second highest class. They were the Creoles, and they felt that they were being treated unfairly in the Latin American Revolution by the Peninsulars, or Peninsulares, I think that's how I would say it. Ay, esos gringos, pinche esos gringos, no pueden hablar en español. Anyway, what was I talking about again? Oh yeah, Creoles. So the Creoles were basically the people who were born over here, but they did not have as much power as the Peninsulares who were born over here. And they will lead a lot of the rebellion. People like Simón Bolivar, he is a Creole. Now, the Peninsular War, we're going to go over very little about this one. I'm just going to give you some quick details. This is during the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon's trying to take over much of Europe as much as he can and other parts of the world. And he is fighting against Spain, Britain, and Portugal. And they're fighting each other as Napoleon is trying to get more power in Europe. And eventually these wars will lead to Napoleon's downfall. But also what it does is it definitely weakens Spain. So it gives an opportunity for groups like the Creoles to try to get more power away from the Peninsulares who have rule in Spain. So the end result of the Peninsular War is basically that it gives an opportunity again for the Creoles and for other people who are in Spanish-controlled colonies to get more rights for themselves and to try to get more freedom. Now, it won't be for the masses of people, because remember, the Creoles are kind of like the second people in charge. They're going to try to get more power at the end of the Peninsular Wars. Now, the junta, these were the people who basically were able to come in Latin America and take power when this fighting was going on in the Peninsular War. I don't want you to have too much more information than that. Basically, the junta were the people, they were able to bring together people, have some power was going on while there was chaos going on in the Peninsular Wars with Spain, Spain, Britain, and Portugal. All right, so if Peninsular War and also if a junta were small, Simón Bolivar is huge. Simón Bolivar is the person most responsible for nations becoming independent in Latin America. He fought large wars of independence against Spain. He was a Creole who was fighting against the Peninsulares to try to make one very large country he wanted to have called Gran Colombia. Gran Colombia was supposed to be like all the way from Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, parts of even Brazil were supposed to be part of his Gran Colombia, which was going to be a huge nation. It didn't work, and eventually it splits up. Ecuador was the first to leave, then other nations like Colombia and Venezuela followed after that. This would be in the 1820s when this occurred. But he is seen as the liberator, or the person who brought a lot of the Latin American revolutions to happen and for them to become free. And he was a leader who was a Creole who was trying to get more power, especially for the people with the Creoles. Not so much for the people underneath them like the mestizos, the natives, and those people, more for the Creoles. The Jamaica Letter was written by Simón Bolivar. It was written where basically he says what kind of governments that he wants to have for independence in South America and Latin America. It is basically his letter that he is writing to one of his friends from Britain, explaining what kind of government he wants to run, what kind of freedom that he wants to see happen to the people in South America. And it's kind of like their Declaration of Independence in a way. It's his way of declaring independence for the people of the Americas from the people of Spain. The Monroe Doctrine, this one's kind of a throwback from a previous chapter. The Monroe Doctrine basically said, the United States said to Europe, hey, the Western Hemisphere, where the Americas are, that is our sphere of influence. Hands off! This is where the United States has the, our influence, and we can protect the people of this area. So it's basically the United States establishing their influence in the Americas. Caudillos is our new word. This would be a word after the independence movements in Latin America, which again, you got to remember, the Peninsulares were on top and the Creoles were leading a lot of the movements. What happened was a lot of the Caudillos were people who were landowners who were able to take over a lot of the power. A lot of them implemented in some of the new Latin American countries military dictatorships. There was no democracy for the masses of people. Again, the masses of people weren't Creoles. They were the mestizos and the more indigenous people, or even African people. But the Caudillos were kind of a symbol of the people who were like the Creoles near the top, able to get power. And oftentimes, they had military dictatorships as their form of rule, which would be in many of the new countries like the Colombias, Venezuelas, Perus, Bolivias, after they were independent. Our next word, haciendas, is where many caudillos lived. Haciendas were kind of a remnant of when Spain was in charge. I mean, their original roots go back from the time when you had the encomienda system, and eventually you had large lands that were owned by people that had slaves working on there, indigenous people or Africans. After independence, most of the people in charge were the Creoles or the Criollos, and they were able to take their land and basically stay in power. They were now the top dogs, and much of the land in Latin America was owned by people in haciendas who had indigenous people or mestizo people working for them on these large farms. So the balance wasn't quite there after the revolution. It wasn't a revolution so much for the poor. The Grito de Dolores. This was the Grito for Mexican independence, which actually is what the Grito for Mexican Independence Day is in September. This was the bells that were run by Padre Hidalgo in it was 1825, and it was rung by him as basically the start of the rebellion. And what separates the Mexican rebellion from most of the other rebellions in Latin American independence is that this one was fought more by the indigenous mestizo people and a lot more of the poorer people, the working class people, than just the upper class. So the revolution started with the bottom. Eventually, the Criollos and leaders kind of take it over, and it becomes a rebellion. Mexico does get their independence. But the most important thing to know is that the Grito de Dolores is the beginning of the Mexican revolution for independence, so the Mexican War of Independence, when Mexico does become its own country.